My brother's fiance once asked if she could borrow my brand new BMW for a week-long girls' trip to Miami. On its own, that's already bold, but this is the same woman who managed to wreck two of her own cars in less than a year. So when I told her no, she didn't just get upset. She turned my refusal into a full-on revenge mission against my car. And the best part? The whole thing was caught on camera. What she did next made that simple no look like the easiest part of the story. So here's where it began, the request that sparked it all. I was sitting at home one evening when my brother's fiancée strolled in with this big, confident grin, like she was about to hand me lottery wings. Instead, she dropped a question so bold it made me stop and replay it in my head just to be sure I heard it right. She wanted to take my brand new BMW to Miami for a week-long getaway with her friends. Not a quick errand, not a weekend out of town. An entire week of hauling luggage, blasting music, and cruising South Beach in a car I'd only just driven off the lot. On paper, some requests deserve a moment's consideration. This one didn't even get past the starting line. Her track record behind the wheel is catastrophic. Within the past year, she's already managed to write off two of her own cars. The first accident happened when she was texting at a red light and plowed straight into the SUV in front of her. The second time, she spun into a ditch on a rainy night. She blamed the weather, but everyone knew speed and negligence were just as much at fault. And here she was, standing in front of me, asking to take my BMW across the state like she was borrowing a casserole dish. On top of all that, this wasn't some spare vehicle collecting dust in the garage. I had only purchased it a couple of months ago. I was still making payments on it, and it symbolized years of hard work for finally turning into something tangible. To me, it wasn't just a car. It was pride, sacrifice, and proof that the grind had actually paid off. So handing it over to someone with a driving rap sheet longer than a grocery receipt wasn't on the table. Her delivery of the request was almost casual, like she fully assumed I'd hand over the keys without a second thought. It felt less like she was asking, and more like she was reminding me of something I'd forgotten. You'll say yes, right? The sheer confidence would have been admirable if the favor in question wasn't the equivalent of handing pyrotechnics to someone who thinks stop signs are optional. As she waited for my answer, my mind raced. I couldn't just call out her driving history without blowing up the room and putting my brother in the middle of a war he desperately wanted to avoid. Instead, I went with diplomacy. I told her the car was still new, I wasn't comfortable with anyone else driving it, and suggested she look into renting something instead. I tried to keep it light, neutral, and polite, but underneath, the message was crystal clear. There was no way she was driving my BMW. The reaction was immediate. Her expression flickered from disbelief to annoyance, as if no one had ever denied her anything before. For a few seconds, she just stared at me like I had spoken another language. My brother, avoiding eye contact, buried himself in his phone, obviously hoping that if he stayed quiet long enough, the tension would dissolve. My wife shot me a discreet nod of approval, silently urging me to hold my ground. That moment revealed everything about how she operates. For most people, no is the end of a request. For her, it's the start of a battle. She wasn't going to file this away as a mild disappointment. She was going to treat it like a personal insult that needed payback. At the time, I let out a quiet breath of relief, thinking I had dodged the chaos by keeping it civil. But what I didn't realize was that the refusal wasn't the end of the problem. It was the spark. And when you look at her history on the road, the kind of choices she makes, it becomes obvious just how explosive that spark was about to become. A history of wreckage. When you line up her history behind the wheel, it's less a string of unfortunate events and more like evidence in a case study about recklessness. The first crash happened at a red light, where she decided scrolling her phone mattered more than braking. Predictably, she rolled forward and slammed into the car in front of her, then later brushed it off as the other driver's fault for stopping too fast. The second wreck came only months later. It was raining, visibility was rough, but every other driver managed just fine. She didn't. Her car ended up nose first in a ditch. The way she told it, the storm had betrayed her, but in reality, it was her foot on the gas and her inattention at the wheel. 2 total cars in under a year, and still no acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, she was the common denominator. And her track record doesn't stop with the driving. When my brother loaned her his DSLR, a camera he'd saved up for, he made it clear to keep it safe from moisture and sand. When it came back, the screen was cracked and the lens was grinding with so much sand it could have been mistaken for a souvenir from the beach. No apology, just a casual shrug as though million-pixel equipment was meant to double as a shovel. And then there was the dress she borrowed from my wife. It wasn't high-end, but it held sentimental value, something my wife cherished. She wore it to a wedding, spilled an entire glass of red wine all down the front, and acted like it was comedy night instead of damage control. The stain never came out, and she never once offered to cover the cost or even say she was sorry. I think most people can forgive 1 bad mistake, 2, maybe 3 if someone shows they actually care about fixing the damage. What stood out with her was that the aftermath always looked the same. Blame shifted elsewhere, no real accountability, and a shrug that said, "What's the big deal?" Whether it was a car, a camera, or a dress, everything returned in worse condition, and everything was someone else's problem, never hers. That consistency wasn't bad luck. It was her pattern. By then, it was easy to see a bigger picture. Giving her my car wasn't just a gamble. It was practically inviting disaster. Each story built on the last until the conclusion was obvious to anyone paying attention. Refusing her request wasn't about being selfish, and it wasn't an insult. It was common sense. That's why, when I said no, I knew it was the only answer. But knowing I was right didn't make what happened next any easier to sit through. The fiery meltdown. The instant the word left my mouth, she went off like a firecracker. Her voice shot up, her arms cut through the air, and suddenly I was no longer in my living room. I was in the middle of an unpaid reality TV audition. She accused me of being selfish, of caring more about a chunk of metal than about my own family, and she said it all loud enough that I wondered if the neighbors thought we called in a film crew. My brother stayed glued to the recliner, eyes locked onto his phone in a way that screamed, "If I don't blink, maybe none of this is happening." My wife tried to step between us, layering in gentle tones of reason, lines like, "Let's settle down and we can talk this through." But her voice vanished under the shouting, each attempt steamrolled by another dramatic hand swipe or a sharper accusation. The show rolled on. She alternated between snapping in rage and pretending she might burst into tears, only to swing back again at full volume when nobody bit. At one point, she even lunged a hand toward my car keys on the counter as if pure willpower could move them into her pocket. Theatrics aside, her argument boiled down to a simple attack. I was letting a car matter more than family. Sitting there, I couldn't help thinking it was less family discussion and more primetime episode no one asked to watch. When the yelling didn't sway me, she escalated. Her whole posture stiffened, her voice dropped into something sharp, and she promised I'd regret saying no. Not maybe, not someday, just flat-out certainty. She punctuated it with a door slam that rattled the walls, her exit loud enough to feel rehearsed. Silence followed. The kind that doesn't settle in, but presses down, like weight. Life eased back into the sofa, pinching at her temples, exhausted from playing peacemaker. My brother shifted in his seat, glanced at me briefly, then looked away without an apology, without even an acknowledgement. It wasn't just her meltdown that stung. It was his silence, the way he refused to step in as though neutrality was his permanent role. I glanced at the key still sitting safely on the counter and felt a flicker of relief. But layered under it was the unease from her threat. Nothing about that performance suggested she was finished. It wasn't closure, it was foreshadowing. For the next couple of days, the house grew quiet again. Outwardly, life looked normal. But under the calm, it felt like the floor was holding its breath, waiting for the next crack to appear. The calm before the storm. 2 days slid by after the outburst in my living room, and for a short while there was nothing but quiet. No angry texts, no unexpected visits, no slamming doors that had the whole street perking up their heads. Just silence. My BMW sat outside like always, clean and polished, catching the morning light as though to reassure me everything was under control. If someone had walked past then, they would have thought life was moving on without a hitch. And honestly, part of me started to believe that too. Maybe she'd vented her frustration elsewhere. Maybe my brother finally had a word with her. Maybe the whole thing was going to burn itself out. For the first time since that fight, I let my guard down. But the timing of that fragile piece couldn't have mattered more. Because I had one of the biggest days of my career approaching. A presentation I had been working on for months was scheduled, slides polished, notes trimmed down to the sharpest form. The sort of high-stakes moment where arriving late or looking frazzled could undo the hours of preparation I had put in. The kind of day where my boss's eyes weren't just on the presentation, but on me. I wanted to walk in crisp and confident, and I had prepared for it with almost obsessive precision. Shirt ironed, shoes shined, my suit laid out like an athlete's gear before a championship game. When the morning finally arrived, I treated every step of my routine like it was choreography. Coffee brewed exactly on time. Tie fastened without a wrinkle. Papers stacked neatly into my portfolio. I checked the mirror once before leaving and even allowed myself a small smile. I looked like someone ready to be taken seriously. The stakes were high, but all the preparation had me steady. In fact, I cracked a small internal joke to myself while heading out the door. I felt like a guy in one of those motivational ads. Confidence lighting me up in slow motion, except my soundtrack was just the hum of the coffee maker still running in the kitchen. But the trouble with picturing yourself in that kind of scene is you never know when someone else has already rewritten the script. I walked down my steps, shoes catching the early light, and shifted my gaze to the driveway where my BMW was waiting. It should have been routine, sliding into the driver's seat and heading off to one of the most important mornings of my career. That assumption lasted up to the moment I caught a glint on the car's surface that didn't fit. At first, it didn't register. My eyes picked up long, uneven lines running against the polished side of the car, but my brain tried to explain them away. Maybe dust, maybe a streak of water dried in the sun, maybe shadows bending at odd angles. I stepped closer, unconsciously holding my breath. But the truth sharpened with every step. What I saw wasn't light or dirt. It was deep, raw damage impressed into the paint. The BMW I had guarded so carefully had been torn into. Entire panels wore scars, dozens of them. Jagged strokes dragged across the doors long enough and harsh enough that there was no mistaking their intention. This wasn't a bump from a careless passerby or a shopping cart gone loose. It was deliberate. Someone had taken something sharp and scratched away layers of paint with a kind of angry precision. Both sides of the car were carved into. The glossy surface narrowed, a patchwork of cuts that caught the light like fresh wounds. I stopped a few feet away, shifting the portfolio in my hand, and just stared. One moment earlier, I had been rehearsing the beginning of my presentation in my head. Now, I couldn't think of anything but the marks cutting through the most valuable thing I owned. Outside, everything else continued as if nothing were wrong. Neighbors watered their lawns, cars pulled out of garages, dogs tugged at leashes. To anyone watching, I probably looked like I was admiring my BMW, pausing to make sure the paint still gleamed. But my stomach was tight. I realized I wasn't looking at just cosmetic damage. I was looking at the physical embodiment of a promise I'd brushed aside. Because this wasn't random. Vandals don't camp out in quiet suburban neighborhoods. They don't wait 2 days before picking the one car on the block to target, the one belonging to the guy who had been shouted at, threatened, and told directly that he'd regret it. This was personal, and I knew, without needing to say her name out loud, who had been petty enough and angry enough to carry it out. I tried to steady my breathing. This was supposed to be a morning where all of my focus and energy funneled into proving myself at work. I'd done everything possible to prepare for that, and yet, at the exact moment I needed a clear head, I stood in front of a car that had been vandalized like it was an act of spite performance art. My sharp suit and polished shoes did nothing to shield me from how powerless the sight made me feel. Sliding into the driver's seat didn't feel the same as usual. The interior was untouched, leather smooth, console gleaming, but outside it was carried by panels now ruined. Sitting there, I couldn't help but feel like the car itself told a story I didn't want attached to me. An object that once represented effort and achievement now bore the evidence of someone else's anger. That morning was no longer just about driving to work and proving myself. It was about holding it together long enough to function while my head ran circles around what was happening back at home. I turned the key, hands tight on the wheel, knowing I couldn't afford to fall apart, not yet. But deep down, the message had already landed. Her storm hadn't been an empty outburst. It had left its mark, and I was staring right at it. Still, I hadn't seen the full scope of what had been done. From where I stood, I only had a partial view. Moving closer would reveal details that were even worse. And once I saw them all, there'd be no pretending this was some kind of unlucky accident. The discovery of the crime scene. Up close, the damage left no room for interpretation. Both driver's side doors had been scored with long, deliberate lines that cut past the paint and into the metal beneath. These weren't minor scrapes that a buffing pad could erase, as they were deep, intentional gouges that would require bodywork to fix. The sheer force of the strokes was obvious. Whoever had done it had pressed down hard and dragged the tool across the panels again and again, ensuring the scars would stay visible. I circled the car, cataloging the mess. The hood carried its own set of scratches, shorter but no less destructive, scattered at sharp angles, as if the vandal had paused, experimented, then pushed forward with a sick determination. This wasn't a 2-second act of mischief. Whoever stood here had taken their time. They started on one side, circled to the front, then back again, almost choreographed, like they wanted to guarantee no section was left untouched. The repetition gave it away. It wasn't careless, it was purposeful. I bent down slightly, holding my palm just above the paint without making contact. In the morning light, the scratches glared back at me, sharp edges catching the sun and throwing it in my eyes like shards of glass. Some cuts overlapped in wide arcs, while others looped tightly, as though the attacker had leaned in with extra force to gouge circles into a surface that had once been flawless. None of this suggested randomness. A bored teenager wouldn't create a pattern like this. They'd swipe once and disappear. What I saw was the mark of someone venting resentment, and doing it in a way designed to sting long after they were gone. My chest felt heavier the longer I stood there. It wasn't just property damage, it was the violation of pride, of hard work reduced to scars by someone who wanted me to see it that way. There was nothing accidental in these lines. They were loud, intentional, and they carried weight. I thought again about the phrase she'd spat at me in my living room, promising I'd regret saying no. Standing there, in my suit and tie, staring at the aftermath, it didn't feel like a coincidence that this was the morning her promise had materialized. Even so, my brain ran through the checklist of alternatives. Could someone else have done it? Was there any scenario where a random passerby had chosen the only new car on the street to lash out at, down to both sides in the hood? But our block wasn't busy. Kids didn't roam with coins or nails in hand, and nothing about the scarring said sloppy thrill. It said personal. When I narrowed the field of suspects, there was only one person it realistically pointed to. The timing, the style, the message, it all traced back to her. Still, frustration gnawed at me because suspicion was all I had. Intuition doesn't translate into evidence. And for something like this, where insurance companies and police reports would be involved, suspicions weren't enough. She would deny it outright, the same way she denied texting behind the wheel when 3 different people swore they saw her doing it. Without something concrete, like a photo or a recording, I couldn't attach her name to the scratches in any official capacity. That cold reality cut deeper than any gouge on the metal. As angry as I was, I couldn't storm across town pointing fingers when all I had was my gut. Standing in the driveway, I pulled out my phone, angling it at the panels, the hood, then each door. The camera captured every mark, line by line, the reflective glare spotlighting the damage. It felt hollow to just stand there and click away, but I knew I'd need these shots. At the very least, insurance would demand them. And when I eventually involved the police, which I now accepted I'd have to, it would help to have this catalog of proof. Documentation wouldn't repair the car, but it grounded me in a process. It shifted me from powerless to at least prepared. I also knew what came next involved paperwork, phone calls, and patience. Insurance wouldn't so much as consider covering this without an official police report. Filing that meant explaining what had happened, showing them the photos, and admitting that I had suspicions but no direct evidence yet. I could already imagine the officer's pen pausing mid-note when I got to the part about my brother's fiancé. But however awkward that conversation would be, it was step one in moving forward. Turning back to the BMW, I noticed the passenger side looked almost like an afterthought. A few faint streaks, nothing compared to the other panels. It was lopsided by design, like whoever did this wanted to make absolutely sure I saw destruction the moment I walked out the door. If I had stepped out a different entrance, I might have assumed for a few seconds longer that the car was fine. But walking straight toward the driver's side, suited and sharpened for an important day, the wreckage was impossible to miss. That placement felt calculated, meant to strike first thing and ruin momentum before the day could even begin. And it did. My throat tightened, my jaw locked. I wasn't just looking at keyed paint. I was staring at an interruption timed with precision. This wasn't about the car alone. It was about derailing my life where it hurt more. The BMW had become the medium, but the real message was about power, about breaking focus, about proving she could reach into my lane and drag me off course without ever laying a hand on me. From a few feet away, I stopped taking in individual scratches and saw only the whole. A car meant to look sleek and sharp instead bore jagged scars that screamed resentment. She had accused me of being selfish and uncaring, but the irony was etched into the steel itself. She destroyed something that represented sacrifice and years of work. Every inch of paint lost to her anger was proof of what really mattered to her. And as much as the cost of repairs and insurance paperwork weighed on me, a bigger dread crept in. How far she'd be willing to go next. 4 minutes, I just lingered there, stuck between fury and disbelief, knowing this wasn't how the day was supposed to begin. The whole point of my preparation was to arrive clear-headed, polished, ready. And now, before I'd even reached the office parking lot, the morning had already been derailed. I shut off my phone after gathering the last photo, slid it into my pocket, and pulled open the car door. The seats and dashboard looked the same, spotless, orderly, untouched, but stepping inside felt completely different. The shell that once embodied achievement had been hollowed into something else, a monument to someone else's bitterness. I started the engine, gripping the wheel harder than usual, and tried to push down the heat building in my chest. The question wasn't whether I could drive to my next stop. The question was what kind of wrecked frame of mind I'd show up with once I got there. Because the morning wasn't just any morning. It carried weight beyond steel and paint, weight that mattered to my future. And now, all of that felt suddenly compromised. A career day ruined. The day she decided to vandalize my car wasn't just any morning. It was the morning of a presentation I had been preparing for months. This meeting was no routine check-in. It was the kind of career-defining pitch that could put me in line for larger contracts and promotions if I delivered it cleanly. I had every detail ready. Polished slides, sharp notes, even the timing of when to pause so my words would land. Yet all of that careful preparation unraveled the moment I stepped into the driveway and saw the car. Time slipped fast after that first shock. I stood staring for longer than I probably should have, trying to absorb what I was seeing, fighting the urge to storm back inside and scream. But the clock didn't stop. I checked my watch and realized the extra cushion I had built into my schedule was already gone. I had planned to get there early enough to breathe, set up calmly, maybe even review a few lines. Instead, I was frozen in my suit under the morning sun, piecing together how a chunk of metal covered in scratches had just hijacked the biggest day of my career. There wasn't room for indecision. I couldn't skip the meeting, no matter how sick to my stomach I felt, and calling the police right then would swallow the rest of my morning. So I slid into the driver's seat, started the car, and headed toward the office. The purr of the engine, normally something that gave me pride, felt hollow. Even at red lights, every reflection around me was just another cruel reminder. My own side mirrors gave me unwanted glimpses of the gouges along the panels. Cars idling next to me seemed to linger just a second too long, and I couldn't tell whether other drivers were actually staring or if my embarrassment was painting their eyes onto me. Either way, the short drive stretched like an eternity. Halfway there, I caught the absurdity. I was dressed like a man presenting his future, yet I was driving into the lot in something that looked like it had gone 12 rounds with a scrapyard. It felt like walking into an interview in a wrinkled bathrobe, stripped of the image I had built for myself. I even pictured my managers glancing from the conference room window, spotting the shredded paint across the lot, and quietly laughing in disbelief. Is that how he takes care of his investments? I clenched the wheel tighter, trying to banish the thought, but it stuck. I reached the office nearly 10 minutes later than planned, rushing to gather my papers before stepping out. The way the morning sun hit those scratches, bright silver against the black finish, was like salt in the wound. Normally, I'd look back at the BMW with pride, double-click the lock, and stride in ready. Now I practically wanted to jog past it and pretend it wasn't mine. Her parting words from that meltdown replayed in my head. She had wanted me to regret saying no, and in that moment, it was clear she hadn't just meant inconvenience. She wanted this exact outcome, me rattled, distracted, ashamed on the day that mattered most. By the time I walked into the building, I had to force myself into performance mode. I shook hands, smiled where expected, and began to deliver lines I had practiced in my living room countless times, but my focus wouldn't stay put. While I tried to highlight revenue forecasts and anticipate questions, half of my brain was still in the driveway staring at those gouges. Cost of repairs spun like static in the background. Calls to my insurer ran side by side with worst-case arguments I knew I'd face with my brother. And no matter how I tried to silence it, the smugness I had seen on her face before storming out replayed like a loop. Even when the managers nodded at good points and jotted notes, I couldn't gather momentum. Each time my voice wavered, I imagined her laughing somewhere, satisfied I was unraveling just like she wanted. I was supposed to own that room, but instead I wandered through it like someone trying not to collapse. And the bitter part was knowing I hadn't stumbled on my own. Someone had shoved me off balance for sport. When it finally ended, the adrenaline drained all at once. I left the room unsure if I had impressed the very people I needed to. Whatever success I had hoped for was drowned under the frustration still pulsing through me. Outside, sunlight bounced across the same wrecked panels, daring me to look. Walking back to the BMW was like walking toward a monument of sabotage, a reminder that even if the meeting would find on paper, the day itself had been hijacked before it even started. Later that afternoon, on the ride home, I made the practical call. I contacted my insurance company, knowing I would eventually need thousands in bodywork. Their answer was as procedural as expected. For vandalism claims, a police report comes first. Without that, repairs wouldn't even enter their system. So not only had she destroyed what was mine, she had layered additional hours of red tape on top of the personal embarrassment. It meant setting aside time to explain everything formally, knowing her name would come up, and bracing for what would follow once my brother learned I had involved authorities. But the cruelest detail wasn't the paperwork or the cost. It was the timing. She had waited until that morning, not before or after. If the keying had happened 2 days earlier, I would still have lost my temper, but I could have entered the meeting focused. 2 days later, maybe I'd have processed some of the rage. But that specific morning, lined up against months of preparation, was a choice meant to bleed into every second of my workday. That was the point. She didn't care about property. She cared about disrupting something that had nothing to do with her. That thought stayed heavy long after work ended. Most vandalisms leave you angry, then fade as the process of repair begins. Not this one. She had tied her revenge to a moment I couldn't redo. The car could get fixed eventually, I knew that, even through the nausea. But the career shot I wanted, walking into a room composed, sharp, and confident, that was gone. No body shop could rewind me into that morning as my best self. Pulling back into my driveway that evening, I stared at the damage one more time before shutting off the engine. The emotion had cooled from pure rage into something colder, certainty. She hadn't just lashed out in a tantrum. She had crossed a line. I stood looking at the scratches glowing faintly in the setting light, and I knew this wasn't just a personal feud anymore. It had turned into something bigger. And as I locked the door behind me, still replaying the day in pieces, I had no idea that by the next morning a new detail would emerge. One that would start turning all of that frustration into the first trace of proof. The case builds. The following morning started with me outside again, circling the BMW like it was a crime scene still roped off in my mind. The damage wasn't going anywhere, but I needed to check angles and keep my documentation thorough for insurance. That's when one of my neighbors walked over. He's the type who always knows the pulse of the block, not gossip-driven, just genuinely tuned in. He'd caught me with my phone out, taking more photos of the mess, and asked if I needed help. Then he mentioned something that snapped me out of the fog. He had exterior security cameras covering most of the street. He wasn't sure if they caught anything, but the thought alone sent a jolt through me. Until then, all I had was frustration and suspicion. Now there was a real chance at evidence. Later that day, I saw him waving me over. He was already set up in his driveway, laptop open on the hood of his truck, scrolling through files like he'd done this 100 times. The footage wasn't glamorous. Grainy black and white stills of sprinklers, pisting, mail carriers making rounds, the occasional late-night dog walker. Then he paused on a clip from around 3 in the morning. My stomach tightened when I saw it. A vehicle crept down the street slower than it should, headlights off, frame edges catching only faint reflections from a nearby street lamp. My neighbor tapped the screen and gave me a look that was part warning, part "you'll want to see this." Seconds later, the car pulled right in front of my driveway and stopped. No headlights, no engine noise the mic could catch. It was moving like it didn't want to exist. A door opened and a figure slid out. The build was familiar even through the fuzz, the walk even more so. Watching her stride toward my BMW felt eerie. I knew that posture, the pacing, the way her arms swung slightly as she crouched and scanned. It was her. My brother's fiancée, sneaking around like a second-rate extra in a spy flick. The camera angle showed her stepping right up to the BMW's driver's side. She glanced down the street twice, pulled something metallic from her pocket, and began dragging it across the panels. You could see the exact jerky movement of her wrist twisting as she worked her way down the door, then circling around to scratch at the hood. The lines were quick and deliberate, not random swipes, but strokes pressed hard enough that the reflection caught even through the camera's low clarity. When she was satisfied, she backed up, checked her work under the lamp glow, then sprinted lightly back to her car. In one motion, she slid in, shut the door, reversed without her lights, and rolled away like the night itself would keep her secret. It was almost comical if it hadn't been my car. She moved around with exaggerated head turns, crouching like she expected laser tripwires across my driveway. It wasn't the clean precision of someone pulling off a clever stunt. It was more like watching a kid act out a spy sequence on a playground. If she'd been humming her own theme music, it wouldn't have looked more ridiculous. Cameras, though, don't grade effort or presentation. They just record, steadily, without sympathy. And there she was, caught in real time. When the clip ended, the laptop froze for a second on the still frame, her body next to my BMW, arm extended mid-swipe. My neighbor looked at me but didn't say a word. He didn't have to. My mouth went dry as the realization sank in. For days, I'd been raging without proof. Now, it was undeniable. There she was, vandalizing my car at 3:02 a.m., headlights off, caught completely. The relief hit almost instantly, right alongside a fresh stream of anger. I didn't just have suspicion anymore. I had documentation. I asked him then and there if he could save me a copy, and he nodded without hesitation. He dug in his pockets, pulled out a small flash drive, slotted it in, and dragged the file over. A few minutes later, he handed me the device. For something that weighed next to nothing, it might as well have been bricks in my palm. That was the shift I had been waiting for. She could deny, she could scream, she could throw tantrums all over again, but I had something stronger than words. As I pocketed it, one line ran through my head. I had receipts, but better digital receipts. Walking back to my own driveway, the contrast hit me. Just a day earlier, I'd been pacing helplessly, imagining scenarios, stewing over humiliation. Now, I had a clip, time-stamped, crystal clear in what it showed. It wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't me trying to convince anyone that I just knew. It was proof carved right into the record, ready for insurance reps, ready for police, ready for anyone who tried to spin his back on me. The calm that followed surprised me. Yes, the scratches still hurt to look at, and yes, the BMW would need thousands in repair. But knowing I had her on file shifted the balance for the first time since she stormed out of my living room. I didn't need to simmer in doubt or worry about being dismissed as paranoid. The camera had leveled the ground I'd been losing. I slid the flash drive into my pocket and stood by the car for another minute. The gouges shone faintly in the morning light, harsh and real, but this time they didn't feel like the final word. She thought she'd thrown me off course and left no trace behind. Instead, she left enough for a neighbor's motion-activated system to catch every second of it. For a long week, she'd held the upper hand with denial, threats, and theatrics. But now the advantage was mine. I had the clip, I had the flash drive, and I had the kind of solid proof that shut down excuses before they even started. The scratches were still carved into the car, but the narrative had changed. And that change pointed me in only one direction. With the evidence in my pocket, the next step was unavoidable. Putting it in front of the people who mattered most and letting the truth knock down whatever defenses she was about to throw up. The great confrontation. I called my brother and asked him to come over. He didn't arrive alone. She was right there with him, practically glued to his side. He came through the door looking uneasy, like he already knew the mood waiting inside. She was the opposite. Chin lifted, arms crossed even before we spoke, her whole posture screamed defiance. The difference in how they entered the house was enough to paint the entire picture. He looked cautious. She looked ready to attack. I told them both to sit down and skipped any kind of small talk. My laptop was already open on the table. I didn't waste words explaining. Instead, I simply queued up the footage and hit play. The screen flickered to life, showing the shadowy street at 3:02 a.m. A car slid into frame with its headlights off, rolling slow and deliberate until it stopped in front of my driveway. The figure climbing out was unmistakable, her car visible behind her, the posture instantly identifiable. Even before she started moving, the tension in the room thickened. I let the clip run until it showed her walking along the driver's side of my BMW, pulling an object from her pocket and dragging it across the paintwork. The faint scrape even caught on the microphone. I hit pause right there, her arm frozen mid-swipe, her car parked alongside mine. No narration needed, just silent stretching while the image held on the screen. My brother leaned forward, staring hard at the frozen frame. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as though the longer he looked, the fewer ways he could rationalize it. Across from him, she barely waited 2 seconds before exploding. She shot up from her chair, voice raised, pointing at the laptop as if sheer volume could undo the still image. "That's not me," she insisted. It was immediate, loud, and desperate. What followed was a jumbled cascade of denials jammed into rapid succession. She claimed the clip was edited, then declared it must have been some look-alike, then accused the timestamp of being wrong, as if 3 different defenses all stacked together would balance each other out. It was the kind of frantic logic a child uses when caught red-handed, hoping if they throw enough explanations into the air, something will stick by accident. My wife, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway, scoffed outright. The idea that I had somehow engineered a fake video out of grainy neighborhood security footage was ludicrous. I wasn't running a forensics lab out of our home office. And besides, my neighbor's system had handed over the clip with no tampering involved. The more outrageous her excuses grew, the more hollow they sounded echoing in that quiet living room. My brother didn't speak. He didn't even try to defend her at first. He just kept shifting his eyes between the paused video, her flailing gestures, and me sitting back in silence. You could see the cracks spreading in his expression. He knew the car on the screen. He recognized her jacket, her shape, even the way she carried herself. None of it could be mistaken for someone else. And the harder she denied, the deeper he seemed to sink into himself. I watched his face more than hers. The lines around his mouth stiffened, and tension clenched his jaw. He wasn't just seeing the clip. He was hearing the lies layered over it and realizing they didn't add up. That slow unravel played across his features like a weight pressing down on him. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud or dramatic. He simply muttered with a tone flat as a slammed door, "That's you." 3 words, nothing else, but they hit harder than anything I could have said. She froze, mouth open as if another excuse had been ready, but those words cut her off before she could spit it out. Panic flashed across her face. She turned to him for backup, pleading, "You don't really believe this, do you?" Her voice broke mid-sentence, her composure cracking as her audience, her fiancé, stopped buying what she was selling. The noise in the room shifted tone after that. She kept ranting, circling back to claims of betrayal and setups, raising her volume with every sentence. But the fight was gone from my brother's face. He didn't interrupt her, didn't jump to her defense. His silence spoke more than her shouting. The louder she got, the quieter he became, and that contrast carried more finality than any argument could. At one point, she was pacing like a trapped animal, throwing blame in every direction, accusing me of manipulation, accusing my wife of bias, accusing the neighbor of fabricating the clip, and none of it landed anymore. They were words spilling into the air, unsupported by even a sliver of credibility. Meanwhile, my brother stayed still, hands clasped together, staring at the laptop screen where the frame had frozen her in incriminating clarity. I didn't add much. I didn't need to. For so many days, all I'd had was speculation and her smug certainty that I couldn't prove anything. Now, in less than a minute, her confidence was cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence. Letting the silence stretch, letting her fill the air with flawed excuses, was more effective than any speech I could deliver. Finally, in one swift motion, she grabbed her bag off the table and stormed toward the door, unleashing one last burst of shouted accusations. She barked about betrayal, about how I had destroyed her relationship, about how none of it was fair. The sound of the front door slamming reverberated just like it had the day she melted down over me, saying no about the car, but this time she left with no one trailing behind her. My brother stayed in his chair. He didn't look at me right away. He stayed focused on the laptop screen, still frozen on that mid-swipe frame, his expression heavy and unreadable. Minutes dragged without him speaking. Maybe he was rewinding every moment he defended her, stacking them up against what was now undeniable. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, he wasn't caught between believing me or believing her. He was left with nothing but truth in front of him, and no escape hatch for denial. The confrontation didn't end with hugs or declarations. It ended in quiet, with my brother lingering in the chair, as if the video demanded he keep staring. My wife eventually moved away from the doorway into the kitchen, the tension lifting little by little. I stayed seated, letting the weight of the moment settle. She had thrown noise at the evidence, but the clip remained what it was, plain, unshakable fact. My brother left eventually, quieter than when he arrived, quieter even than when she stormed out. He didn't tell me what he would do next, didn't offer apologies one way or another. He just carried the silence with him as he walked out. That silence meant more than words could. The video had done what arguing and suspicion never could. Truth had its place on the table now, and it wasn't going back into the shadows. What followed in the aftermath would depend on others, but for me, there was no longer any doubt where this road was leading next. Justice served. The morning after the confrontation, I walked straight into the police station with a flash drive in my pocket. The process was simple. I gave them the footage, they opened it on their system, and the clip played exactly as it had in my living room. Timestamp, vehicle, headlights off at 3 a.m. Her climbing out, scratching my car with something metallic, all of it obvious on screen. There wasn't much for me to explain. The video filled in every gap. The officer typed steadily while watching, eyes narrowing at the details, then confirmed what I already knew. This was vandalism, plain and deliberate. Within that visit, an official report was filed and charges were laid. From there, the case moved quicker than I expected. Once the paperwork was in motion and the footage logged, the officers told me the next step would be to pick her up. I assumed, maybe naively, that they'd call her, set an appointment, and save everyone the spectacle. Instead, they arrested her right where she worked. The officers walked straight into her office building midday, asked for her by name, and escorted her out while her coworkers sat frozen at their desks. She wasn't cuffed in the middle of a chase, but the humiliation was the same. The same woman who had screamed in my living room about being owed my car was now shuffling past cubicles with 2 officers at her shoulder, expression shrinking by the second. Phones stopped ringing, typing paused, and everyone who had overheard her bragging the week before about her Miami trip instead watched her escorted out in silence. What struck me most wasn't justice in the dramatic or cinematic sense, it was the sheer ordinariness of how it happened. She had built her whole persona around being untouchable, the one who always slammed doors and walked away smug. And now her undoing came not from me yelling or family drama, but from 2 officers showing coworkers a grainy video and deciding that was enough. She looked stunned, as though it hadn't crossed her mind that someone would actually take the next step and involve law enforcement. But there she was, hand on her bag, being led past everyone who knew her, head finally bent instead of raised. Word spread in the family quickly. With a charge for vandalism formally on her record, no excuses worked anymore. For the people who had been on the fence, who thought she was a bit dramatic but maybe harmless, the reality set in. This wasn't a sibling squabble. It was destruction of property logged in police reports backed by security footage. Even if she wanted to pretend it was all a misunderstanding, the record didn't lie. Insurance came next, and it was just as sobering to see the numbers on paper. The adjuster reviewed my car, ran his fingers along the gouges, and gave me the estimate, a little over $4,000 for repainting and bodywork. Both sides of the car would need to. He's stripped, repaired, and finished again to factory quality. My policy covered it, but I still owed a $500 deductible up front. It was exactly what I had dreaded standing there in my suit that morning before the presentation, thousands of dollars in damage I hadn't caused and wouldn't see back until restitution was decided. She thought she had punished me in that driveway, but the paper trail of costs and claims was now lining up to punish her instead. What surprised me most was how fast the fallout shifted into her personal life. When news of the arrest reached my brother, there was no room left for hesitation. He had sat tight through arguments, overlooked the crashes, even looked away during outbursts. But watching his fiancée be arrested at work and charged with vandalizing my car left nothing to defend. A few days later, he called me. His words were brief, flat, but final. The engagement was over. No long apology, no explanation, just that it was finished and the wedding plans were canceled. I didn't cheer when he said it, but I knew it was the right outcome. This wasn't just about a keyed car. It was about someone proving, again and again, that she didn't respect the boundaries, property, or accountability. If he had continued with her, it wouldn't have been wedding deposits alone at risk. It would have been his future. My brother had finally reached the same conclusion I had weeks earlier, though for him it came at the cost of an engagement ring and months of planning. For me, the entire arc closed with an odd sense of clarity. My car still bore the scars at first, the repairs still stung financially, and my week at work had been tainted by unnecessary stress. But the balance had settled. She wanted her tantrum to leave me humiliated and second-guessing myself. Instead, she ended up with charges, an arrest record, a public scene, and a fiancé who no longer wanted to sit quietly by her side. My $500 deductible was irritating, sure, but compared to the cost she paid, it felt minor. I know some stories drag on with endless disputes or settlement talks. This one tied itself neatly. Evidence went to the police, the arrest followed, charges were set, insurance stepped in, and the engagement collapsed. Every link fit back into place the way it should when someone pushes too far. There was no dramatic speech, no grand revenge plan playing out. Just cause, effect, and consequence stacked cleanly one after another. When I think back now to her last words in my living room that I'd regret telling her no, the irony still catches me. She meant it as a threat, but in the end, the regret wasn't mine to carry. Seeing her marched out of work by officers after thinking she'd gotten the last word was proof that sometimes consequences don't arrive quietly. And with that, the focus shifted away from me and my car. The real weight settled on her side, where consequences weren't just monetary or cosmetic. They were personal, unraveling the pieces of her life she thought were secured. That shift in gravity, away from my driveway and onto her choices, was the clearest version of justice I could have asked for. The fallout. When everything moved from confrontation to court, what followed was less dramatic than her meltdowns but far more permanent. The fallout wasn't just about embarrassment or ruined plans anymore. It became about consequences she couldn't argue away.
The engagement had already collapsed, but now the legal system delivered its own judgment. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she accepted a plea deal, probation, mandatory anger management sessions, and an order to pay restitution totaling about $4,500.
That covered the insurance deductible, the cost of fresh paint and bodywork, and the remaining fees tied to the vandalism case. For all her shouting about innocence, the situation quietly closed with her signing paperwork that admitted what the video already showed. While probation kept her out of jail, the punishment still lingered in plain view. She now had a criminal record attached to her name, and restitution took a steady bite out of her paychecks. The anger management requirement was another layer. Weekly appointments meant hours cut from her schedule, and questions she couldn't brush off with excuses. What had started as an act she probably considered a private way to teach me a lesson now followed her everywhere. Courtroom sessions, scheduled check-ins, bills that had to be paid, and the constant knowledge that her own impulsive choice was officially on file for anyone to see. Her personal life dissolved just as sharply. The job she once used to bolster her confidence dissolved after the arrest became public in her office. People didn't forget the image of her being let out by officers in the middle of a workday, and though no one mentioned it to her face, it quietly crushed the opportunity she had once been aiming for. Projects she had been pushing to lead faded into silence. Promotions she hinted at were suddenly off the table. By the time management finally let her go, the real judgment had already landed. She wasn't someone they could trust, either inside or outside the building. Without steady income, the court's restitution weighed even heavier. That collapse forced the most visible consequence. She packed up what little she could manage on her own and moved back into her parents' house. Only months before, she had bragged about planning weddings and vacations, holding on to an image of luxury she could parade around for friends. Now, her reality was the same twin-sized bed she had once left behind, surrounded by posters and wallpaper that hadn't been updated since her teenage years. The same place she may have sworn never to return to had become the only option. It stripped away her curated persona entirely. Instead of fitting gowns and travel itineraries, her daily routine was shared meals with her parents and splitting chores in the same old kitchen. The contrast drew itself clearly. She had once imagined herself as someone admired and envied, central to a story she believed she was owed. But the ending placed her in the most ordinary of settings, stripped of the illusions. It was a downgrade in every sense, leaving her to face the reality she had once mocked, starting over from the point she thought she had already escaped. The financial hit paired with the loss of independence left her exposed in a way no angry speech could mask. Meanwhile, my brother began pulling himself out of the wreckage in his own way. At first, his silence looked like shame. A man who didn't want reminders of how willing he had been to excuse her behavior. But over time, it became clear that he was more relieved than broken. By ending the engagement when he did, he had spared himself from far greater damage. He wasn't tied to her legally, wasn't sharing debt with her, and no longer had to mediate her fights with the people closest to him. Instead, he stepped away clean. His focus shifted back to steady work, healthier friendships, and space he hadn't had in years. Instead of carrying her collapse with him, he left it behind and aimed to recover the quiet stability she had made impossible. For me, there was no triumph in watching her life unravel. It wasn't entertaining to see the deposits vanish, or her job end, or her moving back to her childhood home. The reality was sobering above all else. Every one of those consequences traced directly back to a single, unnecessary act. She took a key to my car with the idea of hurting me and instead carved straight into her own foundation. Every ripple, the breakup, the restitution, the probation, the job loss, the shattered image, was airtight cause and effect. She had control only of the spark, and the fire spread exactly the way physics says it will. What stood out most in the end wasn't the money or even the legal penalties. It was the way her self-image collapsed alongside everything else. She had lived as if people owed her respect without effort, luxury without caution, trust without proof. When she didn't get her way, she lashed out in the harshest possible way she could manage. And in doing so, she handed proof of her entitlement over to everyone, from my brother to her neighbors, to her employer, to the police. In the space of a few weeks, the facade crumbled. The car itself became a strange symbol in all this. When repaired, it returned to looking as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Fresh paint, even finishes, every panel restored to what it had been before her outburst. But her life didn't reset that simply. The restitution payments reminded her monthly of the cost. The lost wedding plans reminded her how fragile appearances were. The move back to her parents' house reminded her how far she had fallen. And the record would remain even after the probation ended, not as a single scratch, but as something etched in official ink. For my part, I don't second-guess my decision. Saying no was the right choice, not only to protect what was mine, but to reveal what lay underneath her constant rehearsed confidence. Sometimes the most ordinary boundary can be the one that saves years of damage down the road. Her spiral showed exactly what happens when entitlement goes unchecked, and I stood where I needed to, clear-headed, steady, refusing. That's where the fallout leaves us. Not with noise or excuses, but with a clear sequence from action to consequence, every step connected without ambiguity. And it sets up a larger truth that has become impossible to ignore. Boundaries protect more than property. They protect your sanity. And when someone bristles at a simple no, it doesn't create conflict, it reveals character. That was the clearest takeaway from everything that unfolded here. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever refused a request and watched all the hidden layers come pouring out? Drop your "I said no" and it blew up stories in the comments below. And if you enjoy true stories of family drama told with some dry humor, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Oh, and one last thought, always park under a camera.